Bogan, countrymen, lend me your ears. Welcome to this Fuds on Film podcast. I am Scott Morris and I'm joined, as always, by my good friend, Craig Eastman.
You could get us all put away for good.
In this podcast, after the sad news the other month there of director Michael Cimino's death, we thought it would be appropriate to take a bit of a look over his body of work for your listening pleasure. We're going to cover the bulk of his output, certainly feature film-wise, as both a screenwriter and a director. We'll be looking at Silent Running, Magnum Force, Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, The Deer Hunter, Heaven's Gate, Year of the Dragon, The Sicilian, Desperate Hours, and The Sunchaser. So that's a good number of things for us to get into. Cimino himself started his career directing commercials, but we're picking up his story as he turns to script writing. He'd actually drafted a few scripts that he'd later go on to direct before his first credited screenplay showed up in cinemas. That is the 1972 sci-fi film Silent Running. This was directed by special effects supremo Douglas Turnbull and has gone on to be something of a touchstone in the 70s miserablest, doom-laden sci-fi subgenre.
Doomed hippie sci-fi.
Yes, there's certainly no jaunty, absolutely crazy Robinson Crusoe on Mars stuff here. It is not...
Is that a good or a bad thing, Scott?
I think in this instance it's a bad thing. What it is not, regardless of what Wikipedia's synopsis might tell you, is a post-apocalyptic sci-fi film.
No.
You can tell this because, as a general rule, societies that have suffered an apocalyptic event do not spend any precious remaining resources on orbital arboretums, nor on equipping said space gardens with pool-playing robots.
It was a difficult cost to justify. There was a bit of pushback from the accounts department.
Yes.
Complicated by not having a receipt for them.
Yeah, pool-playing robots not recognised on Maslow's hierarchy of needs as far as I'm aware.
At least let me have the tax write-off on the pool-playing robots.
We'll claim it's charity. Anyway, from what precious little detail the film dishes out, it sounds rather more like a Soylent Green scenario. There's a vastly overcrowded planet, difficult living conditions, and food manufactured en masse rather than grown organically. Indeed, it seems the situation is so bad that all of the land mass has been given over to urbanisation, but those forward-thinking eggheads and boffins have decided to hedge their bets on biodiversity by building a number of massive orbital greenhouses to host the plant and animal life displaced in case they're ever needed to replant the Earth. On board one of them greenhouses, called the Valley Forge, is the humourless, touchy, space hippie Freeman Lowell, played by Bruce Dern. He's accompanied by 3 12-year-old boys in adults' bodies that, for reasons we'll get to soon enough, we don't really need to concern ourselves with. Also on board are 3 wobbling maintenance robots who go a long way to proving that bipedal robots are a terrible idea. Lowell decides to take drastic action when an order comes through to scuttle the greenhouses and return to Earth. The decision that by itself seems questionable. Surely having done the difficult part of hauling oak trees into space, the running costs can't be that significant. But at any rate, Lowell refuses and sets about hijacking the ship, only very slightly reluctantly murdering his man-child co-workers in the process.
Yes.
The rest of the film shows Lowell making a break for freedom, aided by the robots that he reprograms to help with tending the plants and playing poker to the best of their roundly inadequate manipulator arms ability. These are terrible, terrible robots. Although this doesn't stop Lowell having a more caring relationship with them than any of the humans formerly on board the ship. Crisis comes in 2 forms in the final act, as an approaching rescue ship threatens to expose the lies Lowell came up with to cover his murder and hijacking, and more pressingly for Lowell, the plants that he cares for so much are dying because, incredulously, the botanist assigned to look after the plants hasn't realised that plants need sunlight to survive, making him both a murderer and a clueless buffoon. Having fixed this...
It's not looking so good for him.
No. Having fixed this with the appropriate artificial lighting, he thankfully puts himself out of our misery when he realises that the only hope for the survival of the greenhouse is to jettison it into space to drift along, tended by the remaining robot, seemingly armed only with 1 battered tin can to cover several acres of greenhouse, while Lowell scuttles the rest of the Valley Forge and himself, bringing this ludicrous display to a thankful end. Some people seem to like this film and take it seriously. I cannot for the life of me fathom why. The only positive I can take from it, as you might expect with Trumbull on board, the effects work, specifically the models, are really well handled.
Yeah. Some of them still look all right now.
Yeah. Clearly would have been state of the art today, and as you say, they still hold up quite well today. Everything else, well, the supposed hero is a clown who's only one corpse away from short of being a mass murderer, who was unlikable enough before he started flipping out and killing people, which doesn't really help with the whole empathy thing. And there's not really much in the way of the story after the event, reducing to a number of vignettes of Lowell losing his sanity, which might have been more effective if the character wasn't a cold-blooded murderer, a point I feel I need to come back to fairly often, lest you forget what you're being sold here. And also, perhaps, if he wasn't being played by Bruce Dern, it would help, as whose gurning does not sit well with me.
Whose acting style has always made it very difficult for me to discern between him and the three robots.
Its ecological message is valid enough, but after being beaten about the head with it for 90 minutes, I'm left with the urge to go and start a forest fire. This film makes
it's
my
the
teeth
dawning
itch.
of the age of Aquarius.
Yeah. This film makes my teeth itch. Take it away from me.
I think you've said all that needs to be said. I mean, obviously this isn't as you point out, it's not a directorial effort from Michael Cimino, and I think we can probably chalk this one up to Michael Cimino's bill-paying period. As a writer, I don't think that was Cimino's forte. If this helped him along the route towards his career in directing, then I'm sure it was of merit to him. But it's of very little merit to me, other than as a curiosity. I mean, as you rightly point out, I know enough people who actually hold this movie non-ironically in some. Yeah. Some level of regard, but I remember being stricken by it. I think I probably first saw this in my very early teens, maybe just pre-teen actually, and I remember being really excited by it. But as we've discussed before in the podcast, I think when we were in a disaster episode and talking about my initial affection for the movie Meteor, a lot of that can be put down to the fact that as a young child, I was just willing to give it anything a pass on the basis of space. Fascinated by the final frontier as I was. But I mean, reviewing this now, I mean, I most recently saw this probably a couple of years ago. I think I made the mistake of watching it on satellite TV, and made a stab at revisiting it for this podcast. But I'm not going to lie, I got about half an hour in, and I remember this. I remember how pointless an endeavour this is, and how silly I was as a child. And so, it's very difficult to recommend as anything other than a curio. But, I mean, fill your boots if that's your cup of tea. But I think in terms of the career arc of Michael Cimino, it's of nominal interest only.
Yes, a bad starting point. We can be rather more positive about Cimino's second screenwriting credit, which is Magnum Force, the sequel to Dirty Harry. And indeed, we already have been a year ago to the very day, I think, in our Clint Eastwood episode. And I don't think we need to be repeating ourselves too much, so the basics of it are simply that Harry Callahan, Clint Eastwood of course, finds himself investigating a string of vigilante killings of career criminals, eventually tracking it back to a group of young cops taking the law into their own hands, and Harry must put a lead-based stop to this. Perhaps this was a response to the understandable but I think incorrect accusations of the first film's glorification of police violence and fascistic leanings, and this rather more explicitly shows Harry as an upholder of the law. An uncompromising tough cop for sure, but a servant of the law, not a rewriter of it. And surprisingly, well, perhaps not surprisingly, it's still a very enjoyable film, and it's one that holds up as well, perhaps better than the original Dirty Harry.
Yeah.
And that is not something you can say of any of the other of the sequels to Dirty Harry.
No.
And yes, certainly very well worth watching in the unlikely event that you haven't already seen it.
Yeah, I think before the franchise disappeared down the plug hole of, for the money sequels, this and the original Dirty Harry are probably the only two that you need to own. I think as a piece of cinema, it's not as impactful as the original Dirty Harry, arguably. But I think you might be right in that it's probably a slicker watch nowadays because its focus and its pace is a lot more contemporary feeling than I think Dirty Harry was. So it's more in the language of cinema, it's a much more contemporary piece than the sort of couple of years in between the production of the two movies would otherwise suggest. But it's in terms of, again, Cimino's career arc as a writer, you're starting to see some of the more typical aspects of his focus coming through. So it's dealing with issues which are internal to America. So for him, in this instance, it's about the police corruption, as you say, as much of a reaction to the criticisms of the first movie as anything else, but you do get the impression that he does genuinely want to explore that topic. And secondly, and perhaps most importantly, this much more than silent running highlights Cimino's preference for seeing people shot in the head and whatnot, or just shot in general. And in the case of one poor woman, shot in the breast and knocked out of a window. So it's an entertaining watch, not for the reasons I've just highlighted there, I must point out. I don't want to sound like a massive sociopath or anything. It's an interesting watch. It's a pretty slick film, visceral in places, and I think that's probably Cimino's touch there, more than it is the director's touch. But yes, certainly if you want a jumping on point for some sort of retrospective, and you're interested in his work as a writer as much as a director, then this is probably the place you want to start.
Yes, and it marked a pivotal point in Cimino's career, as during the shooting of this, he got a script that he'd already completed for Thunderbolt and Lightfoot in front of Clint Eastwood, who was interested enough to pick it up and star in it, which opened the door for Cimino to direct. So yes, his first film as a director, Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, this unusually named film sees a young thief tearing out of a car showroom in a half-inch motor. This is Lightfoot, played by an impossibly young-looking Jeff Bridges, which solves half of the film's naming conundrum. He soon picks up what seems to be a preacher running away from an assassin, but who in the fullness of time is revealed as a notorious bank robber nicknamed Thunderbolt, played by Clint Eastwood.
Ah, I see what happened there.
Solving our paragraph-long national nightmare of why this film is named the way that it is. Thunderbolt has been hiding out as his former gang members are hunting him down, wrongly convinced that he's swindled them out of their cut, although frankly explaining why they're wrong would take more time than is really worth. So let's skip on to saying that the initial stages of the film have Lightfoot and Thunderbolt, and boy do these character names not get less annoying the more you have to say them, running away from gang members tracking them down. Red Leary, played by George Kennedy, and Eddie Goody, played by Geoffrey Lewis, in something that's halfway between a chase movie and a road trip. This pivots somewhat abruptly once Red and Eddie corner our protagonists, once Thunderbolt convinces them they hadn't double-crossed them, and Lightfoot suggests a repeat, more or less, performance of their previous heist. Red and Eddie agree after a bit of arm twisting, but there's always a question of whether they all really trust one another, leading to the inevitable double crosses and some tone-destroyingly grisly and plain sad ends for a film that's been a light-hearted knockabout caper, at least until the final reel. That said, the severe tonal whiplash towards the end is the only thing that sticks out in Cimino's directorial debut as a outright misstep. The story's on the thin side, but it's serviceable, and I might well be singing a different tune if Eastwood and Bridges hadn't been cast in central roles. An awful lot of the movie coasts by on their charisma alone, which helps spackle some of the gaps in the narrative. As first films go, it's solid and an enjoyable effort. It's not, however, one that demands viewing from a historical perspective by itself, but it's an enjoyable diversion should you stumble upon it.
Nice. I'm interested now, actually, because I didn't have a chance to watch Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, so I can't comment on it, but I'm interested in some of what you've said there and how it might compare to one of the films we'll talk about a little bit later on, which was Year of the Dragon. But we shall come to that in due course. What's next on the agenda?
Well, next we have the little-known indie hit, The Deer Hunter.
Oh, so, we're up to The Deer Hunter already.
Yes.
Oh, dearie me, talk about one giant leap for mankind. Yeah. Can you imagine? Can you imagine the anticipation amongst the rifle-loving outdoors demographic of Middle America circa 1978, Scott? It must have been palpable. Was
Is
Robert
this film
De
about
Niro...
deer hunting coming out? It sounds like it'll be good. I like deer hunting. I like hunting deer. This is going to be a nice, feel-good family entertainment about shooting Bambi.
About real men. I think the primary question there had to be on people's lips was going to be, was Robert De Niro going to be a 308 Winchester Magnum guy, or perhaps one of those hardcore home ammo enthusiasts who necks 7mm Remington cases to take 284 rounds? Oh man, Scott, how awesome would it be if he turned out to be a compound bow guy who smeared himself in buck feces and slept naked in a tent made of his own flesh or something for 3 years before the hunt? This is going to be...
This is going to use piano wire for close quarters combat.
This is going to be the best movie ever. Imagine then the dismay at what turned out to be 3 hours of arse-numbing polemic against the Vietnam War. The human impact of its indiscriminate psychological atrocities, I don't know why I'm laughing, upon the blue-collar menfolk of the Rust Belt, and its effect on the American psyche in general. Only now do I realise geographically where Pennsylvania is situated on a map of the States, and that it is nowhere near the Rust Belt, but never mind. If you haven't seen The Deer Hunter, you are probably doing yourself a disservice, which is not to say that viewing it is necessarily an enjoyable process. Joining Apocalypse Now among the pantheon of great American movies that turned an inward eye toward the USA's involvement in one of the most divisive, dehumanising conflicts of recent memory, or just human memory, it is a poster child not just for cinema as social introspection, but also the application of bold narrative choices that seem to cap the experimental willingness of the 70s golden era quite fittingly. The movie chronicles the fortunes of a group of Pennsylvania steelworkers. Mike, Robert De Niro, Nick, Chris Walken, Steve, John Savage, Stanley, Jod Cazale, a man who I still miss, well, I didn't know him personally, but whose screen presence I think is sorely missed today. Axel, Chuck Aspegren, and John, George, I've never known how to pronounce his surname, Zunza. Steve's marriage to his partner Angela is imminent, and for him, Mike and Nick, the ceremony will be a last chance to spend time together with their friends and families before heading to Vietnam, having volunteered to serve their country. In unorthodox and no doubt audience-baffling narrative fashion, much of the first act of the movie is occupied with the wedding ceremony, followed by a deer hunting trip which highlights tensions amongst the group and establishes Mike's trust in Nick alone as his wingman in matters as important as blowing the head off defenceless animals. The transition to Vietnam takes some time and is jarringly abrupt, placing the viewer immediately at the centre of the chaos and confusion of war in a way that predates Private Ryan by some 20 years. It's a bold narrative shift, no doubt designed to pull the rug out from under the audience, and it proves very effective in conveying how quickly and utterly the US found the waters of war rising above its head. Cimino, never one to shy away from harsh brutality, throws our trio of friends almost immediately into a genuinely harrowing game of forced Russian roulette at the hands of a group of Viet Cong captors. It's perhaps the movie's most famous scene, and with good reason, but it must have been a tough pill to swallow for home audiences while the wounds were very much still healing. De Niro and Walken both might never have bettered their performances in this scene, let alone throughout the rest of the movie. Alas for our characters, it will not prove the last time that we see the pair face each other across the table with a loaded gun in hand. It's probably difficult for modern audiences to appreciate the total audacity of Cimino's approach, crafting not so much a movie as a cultural punch to the gut that, whilst unflinching to this day, it must truly only have been felt upon release. Often mentioned in the same breath as Apocalypse Now, it's blatantly disingenuous to compare the two, with Coppola's undeniably groundbreaking opus nonetheless closer to Alice in Wonderland with guns than the story being told here. Pretty much everything about The Deer Hunter is cinema firing on all of its most potent cylinders, backed by innumerable career-best performances. When Meryl Streep's presence fades into the subconscious over a movie's running time, you know there is some serious thesping going down, and it's honestly very difficult to find any fault whatsoever amongst the movie's cast. By the time we return to Pennsylvania, minus one member of the group, both the characters and we, the audience, find ourselves not so much having reached a resolution as preparing for a long journey to recovery. I'd forgotten just how excellent a movie The Deer Hunter is, having last viewed it many moons ago when my faculties were still very much forming. Revisiting it now strikes me how much of a kick in the teeth it still represents, and that it has probably remained the ne plus ultra of Vietnam movies. Regardless of whatever else Cimino did or did not accomplish, much of which we will discuss in this podcast, throughout his career he most certainly remained the holder of a respect pass on the strength of this, his best movie alone. Quite remarkable, and this is the point, Scott, at which you probably turn around and say, I've never liked The Deer Hunter.
Well, I've never been able to watch The Deer Hunter. Having now actually got my way through, I think I, on at least 3 occasions I remember, I've sat down to watch The Deer Hunter and got about half an hour to 45 minutes in and went, bored now, and went off and did something else, which is rare for me. But there is something about this film that I just cannot get on with. It is
your white whale.
There's 2 hours of fantastic cinema in there and 1 hour of turgid nonsense at the start. The whole first hour act of the wedding scene, I think, is
it's a difficult sell.
It's not so much that the idea of it annoys me. It's like, obviously it's a good idea to get to know some of these characters, but I think it's just misguided in that you learn far more, in my opinion, about everyone that's not a main character in that first hour than you do about the main characters themselves.
That's interesting, because that's very much a thought I think I'd held in my head over the first couple of times that I watched it. But sorry, carry on.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of really nice little touches about characterization, particularly from the going into some of the other guys, like John Cazale's performance particularly. But I don't feel in that whole hour I learn anything more than you could have got across in about 5 minutes about your actual 2 leads, De Niro and Walken. And if I learn anything at all about John Savage over the course of this entire film, I must have missed it. And I think that's just... it's some narrative in flabbiness in that first hour, and I find it is very difficult to get through. I think it's just a bad hour of film. There's 2 fantastic hours after it, but you really have to take your licks first to actually get to it. But when you get into the whole Vietnam narrative and everything that happens after that, it's a terrific film from that point on. But I just find it difficult to call a film a bona fide classic when a full third of it is poor. In my opinion, I just don't like it. The other 2 hours are as good as cinema can get, probably, in terms of its emotional impact and what it can show about a conflict like this and the effect that it can have on them. It is obviously not particularly, or indeed at all, historically accurate, which we'll come to in future films as well. But it doesn't matter. As many people say, it does capture the actual feeling, the kind of a greater truth of the Vietnam War and how the effect that it had on America. That is fantastic stuff. But that first hour is just tough.
I see where you're coming from with that. I think I feel like I want to give him a pass for that. And as much as I really, really enjoyed The Deer Hunter again, watching it recently, I do. It's not that I find that first hour enjoyable to watch. It is a bit of a trudge. I think it probably works better on a first viewing. If you're watching this film for the first time, I think that first hour probably works better, because I feel like rather than necessarily character development, I feel it's a bit more about sort of community development or way of life development, and the notion is that the movie wants to say, look at this particular class of people rather than these characters individually, and let's get comfortable with this class of people and this particular way of life. Now look what we did as a country to these people when we sent them off to fight. Although ironically, the characters here, I think, weren't conscripted; they chose to go and fight, which seems an odd narrative choice, and maybe I'm missing something there. But even now, I've got to be honest and say that I watched the first hour at double speed. just to get through that, because there actually isn't a lot to be gleaned from it in terms of character, and it is in the latter 2/3 of the film that stuff comes to the fore. But I don't know why, but I had a sneaking suspicion that you were going to have a contrary, well, not necessarily a fully contrary opinion, but something less glowing to say about The Deer Hunter. I still think it remains like a touchstone in modern American cinema, but definitely I think I understand where you're coming from in that first hour. Did you still find, obviously, that transition from the sort of the first hour to the second hour? Did you still find that impactful, or were you just kind of too numbed by that first hour of exposition to feel the kick of that?
I guess it did. It's certainly a very jarring transition. I mean, well, you say transition, it's not even transition, it's a slam cut. And it does work very effectively. And it's not like it's just going into Vietnam as they're chopping in anywhere. It's almost immediately as Mike decides to barbecue someone for...
Yeah, it feels like it's actually in the aftermath of a major battle. It's not even going to drop you into a big battle, or it's like, okay, here's a point where just the last few survivors are mopping each other up.
Yeah, and as I say, from that point on, it is a classic film. It's just the front loading of it makes it difficult to wholeheartedly recommend. I guess I'd have to 2/3 if I heartedly recommend it. But from that point on, it is still a classic. And just to reiterate the things you said, it is such a tremendously brave film to make, especially when the wounds would have been so close from the conflict itself. It's the sort of analysis of a war you would expect to see 30, 40 years later, rather than when it's right on the cusp of memory.
I think it's startlingly mature in that respect. Yeah,
and it doesn't really pull any punches. It's not explicitly having anyone go on a tirade against how this is against the American dream, but just that even something like the last scene of them just singing. It just makes it so effective in terms of getting that across without actually rubbing your face in it about how this is not what the promise of America was, and the horrors that this has inflicted upon people, much more than something like Jacob's Ladder had from just a few podcasts ago. There's a lot of great things in here, and it's a fantastic turn from Walken and De Niro. Walken in particular, it is strange. From him in particular, well, actually both these guys, when you watch their earlier work and realise how great they were, and while they're still, not so much that they're not great now, but now they're quite happily descending into self-parody.
Yeah, and, like Walken particularly, right, is it's hard to remember a point in his career where he wasn't hammy Walken. Yeah, and this is most definitely not. Yeah, I know absolutely what you're talking about there. This is, I still think now when I look back, this is the least Walken of Walken performances, and is all the better for it, I think.
Yes. What else do we see in this film? I guess we also see the beginnings. There's elements of it in Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, where Cimino is not only a great director, but I assume it's himself rather than a cinematographer, but he's able to create some very stunning shots. He clearly loves some mountains. Those shots in the kind of mountain ranges is just absolutely perfectly done, and we'll see that in pretty much everything we talk about from here on in. But a very beautiful film when it needs to be, and obviously that's a stunning contrast with the absolute horrors that he manages to put with that Prisoner of War camp in particular, which is... just a shocking and achieved not by special effects or something, but largely just by submerging your lead actors and rubbing rats on them, which
having them react appropriately.
Yes, stunning stuff from that point, and everything that happens from there on in is also just one emotional gut punch after another. So yes, it all works terrifically well from that point on. It's a great film when it actually gets to Vietnam, but I'm not so convinced that the journey to get there is necessarily worth an hour of your time.
Yeah, so I think we're broadly in agreement on it as a film in general, but we probably have different opinions on how necessary probably only slightly different opinions on how necessary that first hour is. Actually, that's an interesting experiment. If any of you listening haven't watched The Deer Hunter yet, do us a favour and just jump in at the hour mark. It might feel jarring, but it's going to jar anyway in a couple of minutes. So yeah, and let us know what you think of it as just a war movie without the wedding shit.
Yeah, here's what you need to know.
Yes, yeah, basically, absolutely.
There's one guy who talks about one shot a bit, and there's another guy that likes trees.
That is pretty succinct. Yeah, yeah. I mean, regardless though, off the back of The Deer Hunter, the critical praise, the Oscars, it's not hard to see why Cimino was pretty much given a blank check for his next movie, Heaven's Gate.
A regrettable course of action, as it turned out, for United Artists.
Schoolboy error. But not necessarily that it's a bad movie, or again, perhaps your opinion will differ, but I digress, or certainly I get ahead of myself. Chronicling the real-life events of the 1890 Johnson County War, Wyoming, albeit with some obvious artistic license, Heaven's Gate is a movie perhaps more remembered for its impact on its studio, director and stars than on audiences. Chris Christopherson is Johnson County Sheriff James Averill, a Harvard-educated man of privilege who journeys to the town of Casper to find that the County Stock Growers Association are openly arming hired guns in an effort to rid the county of the perceived threat of a burgeoning immigrant underclass. The head of the association, a man by the name of Canton, Sam Watterson, has created a death list of 125 immigrants whom he accuses of cattle rustling to feed their families and who are to be put to death, clues in the name, by a band of bounty hunters at a rate of $5 a day, plus $50 for every immigrant they shoot or hang. You won't find a better deal than that. Despairing at the blatant mistreatment of the lower classes, which Canton assures him is fully sanctioned by all levels of the government up to and including the President, Averill puts himself at odds with the association, and in particular their foremost hired gun, Nate Champion, Chris Walken, an old friend of Averill's who also forms the third corner of a love triangle betwixt the sheriff and his brothel-owning lover Ella, played here by Isabel Huppert. Averill's attempts to garner support from the military are scuppered by the realisation that the powers that be have already informed the local garrison to keep well away from matters relating to the association, and further fuel is added to the personal fire of our protagonist by the revelation that Ella is one of the names on the death list, a fact of which Nate claims to have been unaware. Following an intermission, those were still a thing in 1980, things come to a... and also a bit of a recurring theme in Cimino's works that they will be long. Things come to a head in a second act which is markedly more bleak than the first, with a pretty steep ramping up of violence and an unsettling rape scene, all perpetrated by the association, who are now poised to make their move against the immigrants. Heaven's Gate is many things, most notably an observation of the inevitability with which the elite will always dominate the poor in any society. It is well formulated, well shot, well acted, and a pretty good example of an unrushed narrative given over to its characters. What it is most definitely not is the studio-busting, audience-alienating debacle it has for the last 36 years been portrayed to be. Setting aside the myths surrounding this movie, most propagated of which being that it bankrupt United Artists, hint, it didn't. It is by no means perfect, and certainly not Cimino's best from amongst the limited pool which I personally have seen. It does not, however, warrant anything like the reputation it garnered in the wake of its release, and which blighted many of those involved for decades to come, to a degree where I find it bizarre and almost impossible to conceive that it was quite so ridiculed. But ridiculed it was, the lore growing bigger than the movie, and only in recent years has Gate begun to make any headway in its case for reassessment. I can't imagine this movie will ever climb the mountain of masterpiece to a degree such as, say, Kubrick's Barry Lyndon has done recently, but I feel I can say with confidence that it is a good movie, and perhaps in fact a really good movie. Mileage as always will vary, but if you flirted with the notion of a viewing in the past and been put off, I heartily recommend you satisfy your curiosity. You might just like it. I kind of liked it, Scott.
I kind of didn't, but I'm certainly not on the hate train that it had back in original day.
Shall we meet in the middle?
Strange. I think we probably would. What I think is the warning sign on this is that when you give your plot recap there, you hit pretty much everything that happened in the film.
Yes.
And it's a film that's 3.5 hours long.
Yes.
And you didn't talk for very long there, did you? And this film...
It is perhaps guilty of not quite getting to the point succinctly enough.
Yes, and this film had a first cut of 5.5 hours. At which point, there seems to be just reels and reels and reels of material that's absolutely beautiful but serves no purpose whatsoever, narratively or character-wise. And that's perhaps it's the main thing that annoys me in it. It is a little bit too meandering. It frequently looks absolutely beautiful, as you say. There's one scene in particular where one of the trains pulling at the station with the mountains in the background. That's just a beautiful shot. Yeah. This is a lot of it is, as you might imagine, Barry Lyndon-esque, but there's a number of strange things going on there. There's the whole starting prologue in the 1870s with Averill and Bill Irvin generating from Harvard. Goes on for a long time, looks tremendously lavish and expensive, but serves no purpose whatsoever. Indeed, John Hurt's entire performance serves no purpose whatsoever. What is he doing? Get him out of here. What on earth is the point of that? And there's other characters who normally perform quite quite well, and then some points just go off and have very strange little moments for no particularly good reason, like Christopher Walken's Last Stand, where he does his Butch Cassidy tribute act, and just before he walks out of the burning shack that he's in to get properly Bolivian armied, he takes a moment to write a note to the effect of, "Dear Ella, I am in a burning shack, about to be shot to bits. Whoops, love Nathan." And then exits.
Good luck to you and Avril.
Yes, exits the shack to meet a sustained volley of gunfire that's self-parodic in nature. He's almost shot for as long as that poor Omnicorp schlub in the botched Ed 209 demo in Robocop.
There's an intermission in the middle of him being shot.
Absolutely ludicrous. It just sticks out like a sore thumb. But yes, it does at least pick itself up in the action stakes towards the end. It's perhaps a little bit harsh in the way that it's trying to get its messages across about the state of again the American dream being corrupted by the 1%. It is, but as a film that's looking to sort of demystify and unromance the Wild West as well, it's certainly effective in making no bones about how rough a life it was. It's just a non-stop parade of fights and murder and death and abuse and intolerance. And again, there's a lovely contrast between these beautiful landscapes and the ugliness of what's going on.
It's chambered in the same magazine as films like Once Upon a Time in the West in that respect, which feel like directors saying, look, stop rabbiting on about how great the Old West was. It was an absolutely shit time to live in and a terrible place for anyone to be. There's not a lot to be proud about.
Yes. It does appear that, however, the closest thing that, the closest that Heaven's Gate comes to the literal truth of the Wild West is that there's some documentary evidence of a country called America existing in this time frame, and possibly a place called Wyoming, but everything else, total fiction. Again, you might be using the same argument in terms of you would use in Deer Hunter. It's fiction in service of a greater truth, but on its own terms, everything in this film is a total lie, which makes it a bit difficult to get a hold up in a regard of it being a historical document or anything like that. But yes, you could really have an entire podcast just about the fallout from this film, couldn't you? Lots of very interesting things, as you say, massively over schedule, over budget. Related in no small part due to Cimino's exacting standards, having things like a street set moved at 6 feet apart by dismantling both sides and moving them each 3 feet apart, rather than just moving one side 6 feet apart, because he's insane.
By all accounts, he went full Kubrick on this, right? You hit the nail on the head when you said about pace, because that is absolutely... Now that I've sat down and watched this film, it's absolutely my takeaway from it is that it takes an awfully long time to say nothing, or it takes an awfully long time to say very little, and that's perfectly fine in the context of all of that extra time being spent fleshing out characters, but there's never really a sense that we get to know any of these characters in any depth whatsoever. And Cimino has all the time in the world to explore these people, and many of them I can imagine panning out to be very interesting characters, but absolutely, again, you hit the nail right on the head. John Hurt's character is so front and foremost, and the prologue seems to insinuate that he will be a major character in the film, and that this is someone who's going to have something to say and who will serve some real purpose in this film. And actually, he is so superfluous to proceedings that you quite rightly you could cut out every frame with John Hurt in it and still have the same movie. It begs the question, why the prologue?
Yes,
but I can't help but feel that there is a really good hour 45 movie in here that would retain all of the good stuff and none of the other stuff. And I know that there's always the push for, well, if there is a 5.5 hour cut of that, then really we should see that to appreciate. But if that 5.5 hour cut incorporated 2 hours of additional character exposition, my question would be, did Cimino was he playing the opposites game and cut out the stuff he needed and leaving the stuff he should have cut? I don't think there's an argument to be made there that I hear so many people harking on about, that we need to see the 5.5 hour cut to view it as it was intended. Let's just set about, actually, the director's cut of this film should be literally half the length. Yeah. And I feel like you would have a really good movie there. and I would have no objection to sitting down watching that again. There you go. If any of you have got a copy from the Criterion Collection kicking about and you fancy a Week in Eye movie, do send us a link to the results. I'd like to investigate that possibility, but I have neither the time nor the inclination to do it myself, nor the skill, I might add. But yeah, it's an interesting film, and it's obviously it's one of those now mythological films which achieve that status for all the wrong reasons. And yeah, we, maybe someday when we're stuck for a topic, we'll go back and we can talk about that whole story in another podcast. But there's no shortage of resources on why Heaven's Gate hit cinemas and left as little impact as it did, and why it quite had the effect on people's careers that it did. So go and knock yourself out.
Yeah, I mean, I think I could probably talk about this film for at least another half an hour, but it'd be almost nothing to do with the film itself, and it's all the stuff that happened either around or because of the film, and how most of it's actually not really true.
Yes.
But yeah, that's perhaps a tale for another day, or you can go off and do your own exercises on that one. But it's probably worth watching. I mean, if you are the sort of person who is listening to a podcast about film, then it's certainly worth watching, even if I wouldn't want to recommend it in the traditional sense. I don't think it's worthy of the push for re-examination of people saying that it's it's actually in the top 100 American films. No, it's not. But it certainly shouldn't be in the bottom 100 either. It has its own foibles, but taken on its own terms, it is. You can at least see what he was going for, and I think Cimino hit quite a lot of the things he was going for, but whiffed on a few other things. It's roundly in the middle of his output of work, and certainly deserves nothing like the reputation that it has as being an unmitigated disaster.
There's far more fallout associated with this film than there has any reasonable reason to be, but who knows what was going on in the minds of audiences in 1980. If The Deer Hunter is Cimino on peak Oscar-worthy form, and Heaven's Gate an essay on what historical sources will tell you was a suicidal doubling down on subsequent hubris, then Year of the Dragon surely sees the director slumming it in the wake of a slapped wrist, or perhaps I should say Chinese burn. Now, slumming it in this case comes with several noteworthy caveats, not least of all a script by Oliver Stone and Mickey Rourke as leading man. But in relation to previous achievements, this is definitely a qualitative downshift. And by Jove, how far and fast the mighty fell in the wake of public and critical vitriol. Year of the Dragon is pretty much a genre movie, afforded a budget. And I don't say that in a derogatory sense, nor do I imply any shame in a director of Cimino's prior standing tackling genre material. I would cite the success of Steven Soderbergh within this arena in particular, and if you haven't already listened to our August 10th episode, I implore you to skip back to hear in how high a regard we hold Scorsese's Shutter Island. What is almost immediately evident in this instance, however, is how derivative and uninspired Cimino's effort is, and just how easily Year of the Dragon blends into the turgid landscape of mid-tier 80s cop gangster dramas. Rourke is Stanley White, a police captain and former Nam veteran, who has been transferred from Brooklyn to take charge of policing Manhattan's Chinatown district. Not that anyone expects Stan to do much. The long-standing agreement betwixt the triads, the mafia and the city seems to suit all parties just fine, even as some young upstart Chinese hoodlums threaten to undermine the relative peace by assassinating triad boss Jackie Wong and then shooting a mafia-protected store owner in the midst of the funeral procession. Stanley has other ideas, mind you, and he certainly didn't watch his buddies die face down in the mud just to let a completely unrelated Manhattan underworld demographic maintain the peace in a way that doesn't seem to bother anyone else much. Our protagonist, nominal application of the term, sets his stall out in the first reel by interrupting a board meeting of triad bosses, seemingly just to shout, "F*** you," at all of them, and paint a bullseye on his own back. The Supreme Court has, after all, roundly rejected prior restraint, before proceeding to casually place himself and others in harm's way at any available opportunity throughout the remainder of the movie. It is a resplendent opening gambit, which claims a spectacular victory for both passive-aggressive as well as openly aggressive racism, and also the visual magnificence of older Chinese gentlemen in sharp tailoring smoking. However, it also signifies the strict adherence with which Stone script commits itself to genre tropes that were firmly established at least a decade prior. Rather than pursue his stated remit of clamping down on the street gangs, an act that could be comfortably achieved and readily accommodated by having asked the Triad Elders, "Please can you clamp down on these street gangs?" Stan decides instead to busy himself harassing Joey Tai, John Lone, the son-in-law of Jackie Wong. "Do you see what happens, Joey? Do you see what happens when you find a stranger in the Alps?" This... I'm glad you appreciated that. This proves narratively convenient, as it allows Stan to trip over the revelation that it is in fact Joey who has been manipulating the street gangs in a calculated power grab for the Triad crown. "You're killing your father-in-law, Joey!" Much... Oh dear, there's nothing sadder than a man laughing at his own jokes. Much violence does, of course, ensue as the street gangs escalate their agitation of the established order, and both Joey and Stan endure increasingly combative relationships within their respective organisations. Year of the Dragon certainly has the potential to transcend its trash roots. However, it is mired in what I perceive to be too much apathy from those involved and too little invention or pushing of the boundaries. This is a movie that dearly wants to be taken seriously, while at the same time painting its characters in the broadest of strokes. Stanley, of course, has marital issues and a piece of feisty ass on the side in the form of an English-language Chinatown news correspondent. His superiors do a lot of tutting about how he's a good guy and he really ought to quit with the Nam shit. Joey Tai is a two-dimensional scumbag about whose motivations we learn nothing, and you can spot a street gang member by the fact they dress as though they've just come off the set as extras from the video for Michael Jackson's Bad, as no gang member ever has in the history of gangs and or garment manufacturing.
Hang on, I saw that documentary, The Warriors. I'm pretty sure of this. I see what's going on here.
Was that one of Michael Moore's, was it?
Yeah.
Chief among the movie's problems is that Stan himself is a self-pitying, racist, misogynistic, possibly rapist prick whose continual self-abasement in labelling himself a Pollock apparently provides justification enough for mocking everyone else as a chink, demonstrating an abject failure to grasp the understanding that owning being an asshole does not excuse one from being an asshole. Of Stan's relationship with news correspondent Tracy Zhu, mono-monikered Ariane, about whose background I know nothing, but I'm assuming was she a model or something like that?
Yes, she was a model and swiftly went back to modelling.
Yes.
On the back of this.
Yes, understandably so, because the less said the better, unless you want a discourse on the portrayal of verbal, physical and sexual abuse of secondary female characters as seemingly desirable qualities in a heroic character who is apparently driven by a sense of moral righteousness. Let me get back to you on that. As an aside, I'd also like to highlight David Mansfield's score, a frequently confusing callback to Stanley Meyer's work on The Deer Hunter, which one assumes was intended to craftily inject some pathos into proceedings, were it not that it ultimately comes across as either having been conceived entirely in a bubble, or as though everyone involved forgot this wasn't a movie about a blind shoemaker living in the war-torn landscape of rural Eastern Europe during World War II. Having said all of which, there is enough batty incidental banter and at times borderline slapstick to both A, make the movie enjoyable to some marginal degree, and B, hint at a possible trace of underlying irony that, if it was in fact intended, has fallen clumsily from the movie's grasp as it barrels headlong into baffling mediocrity. And then I've put in brackets, ask me about exploding kitchen taps. Yeah. Yes, Year of the Dragon is a curious beast that no doubt had the best intentions, but feels like it was left on autopilot a little too long, and while it may not crash into the goddamn mountain, it definitely loses its landing gear while skidding to a halt on the runway. 6 dead, 17 injured. On which failed analogy that confuses dragons with aeroplanes, I defer to you, Scott.
I don't know where to start with this film, really.
It's bad shit, really.
There's a lot of things going on in this film. There's a lot of content here, but none of it feels like it's been merged into one film. It just feels like random pages thrown into a script generator. I mean, for example, at one point, more or less out of nowhere, White launches on this spiel about how Chinese labourers were discriminated against and marginalised during construction of the railroads. Fine.
And then erased from the history books.
unlike the entirety of Heaven's Gate, that is accurate.
Yes.
However, it has no place in this film. It was put in entirely inorganically. And there's just no
And it
flow to
suggests
the
a
entire
level of
film.
respect and understanding that is then completely undermined by his adherence to calling them all chinks.
Yeah, there's just no flow to it. And it's probably the most interesting point in the whole film is that, well, according to the internet's arbiter of ultimate truths, Wikipedia, this film is, amongst other things, intended as an exploration of ethnicity, racism, and stereotypes. Presumably the same thing you would say about Roy Chubby Brown, or Andrew Dice Clay, or the Ku Klux Klan. Just so much racism and epithets thrown about the film, just all the time. Apparently, the excuse for that being that White's referring to himself with the same terms, but if your defence is it's not racist if you just hate everyone, doesn't really wash. I don't know. Perhaps I'm a bleeding heart, ivory tower liberal, but I just prefer it when we're not throwing venom at groups of people. And partially, I suppose that's the point of writing it this way. You're not supposed to have any sympathy for the gangs, after all. But the use of language is in no way at all examined by the film, so it just winds up being another element that sits uncomfortably in the mix of this little beast. And that's a minor point, and probably doesn't really deserve that much attention to it. But to be honest, I struggle to come up with a lot of other noteworthy points about Year of the Dragon. It's an entertaining enough watch first time round. I cannot imagine for a second that it warrants repeat viewing. Rourke, I think, doesn't give a bad turn exactly, but he's a little undermined by playing a character that's supposed to be 15 years older than he is. Yeah. And he gives the impression of a child wearing his father's clothes.
Yeah. And chewing lines written by someone who apparently has the intellect of a man 15 years younger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess that's Ariane Kazumi's love interest is one of the rare instances where a Razzie actually seems well deserved. And how she got cast is a mystery, but it doesn't matter all that much. Yeah.
Oh, God.
So yes, this is, and the rest of the support's alright, I guess, but barely featured, and it's very much a Mickey Rourke vehicle in times when such beasts roam the land, and it's living or dying by his performance, and it's alright, I guess. It's by no means a neo-noir classic by any stretch of the imagination.
No.
And
I think tellingly, John Lone's character in Rush Hour 2 has more depth than his character here.
Yes, and it was another failure, commercially at least, in part because of a somewhat understandable protest from Asian American groups due to the language used and the possible negative effects it would have on tourism if people believed that it was a routine occurrence for automatic weapon-based slaughter to be on the menu at Chinese restaurants.
So I wasn't aware of that backlash. I haven't actually read into any of the background of the movie at all, but it's entirely understandable. That reaction does not surprise me at all.
Yeah.
Yes, it's not a tourist board advert for Chinatown, certainly.
Yes,
which I understand to be pretty much as safe a district as any other part of Manhattan.
Yes. Unless Michael Cimino's around, in which case you better be ducking. It's all a bit hard-boiled, but more in the John Woo sense than in the sense of it being a noir sense. It's, I don't know, it's a fine film. I didn't regret watching it or anything, but no. I will never watch this again, and most likely
did you detect a hint of irony there as well, or am I just imagining that? I just felt like there were one or two moments where I thought this movie can't possibly be taking itself seriously at this point. I felt like the tone of the film had been misjudged in the edit or by Cimino himself, and that there was this little aftertaste of sort of like, okay, I'm supposed to be viewing this as much as like a black comedy as anything else, but I don't know. I was really, really confused by this movie.
It certainly would explain a lot, because it is just so taken to the extremes and points where you would not expect it to do so if it was trying to have any grounding in reality at all.
Yeah.
And that would make more sense. And look, Michael Cimino is by no stretch of the imagination a dummy. He knows what he's doing. I think he may have problems actually executing on it, but he would have had a plan in mind. It was not just, here's a generic schlock piece that would could have been handled by essentially anyone. He's trying to put some spin in it, I am sure, but I think he's whiffed on what he's actually wound up with. Again, this is another one that I think he says was where producers were, cutting, making too many changes to his cut and that kind of thing, and he will kind of blame it on that. And he's probably got a point. I'm sure there is something that he's done which was a bit more considered. I mean, Yale graduates tend not to be total dummies, and this should have been greater. I mean, I can't imagine Mickey Rourke, who incidentally I'd forgotten what Mickey Rourke looked like when he was younger. Every time I think of Mickey Rourke now, I think of him from The Wrestler. So I was surprised when I was watching this for half an hour and going, I can't remember why. I didn't remember reading Bruce Willis was in this film. And I was like, oh no, it's Mickey Rourke, right? Okay, that makes more sense. And these guys that he's got in this film have enough talent to probably be doing better than what they're actually doing here. This isn't just or just shouldn't have been a generic period piece, but I think this might actually be one instance where Cimino's continual excuse of producers got in there and messed with his cut might actually be accurate. And
it is nonetheless a movie that could only really have been made in the 80s, right?
Yes.
It's just absolutely an 80s movie, and an example of the type of 80s movie that we should probably be glad we left behind with the 80s. But yeah, it was an entertaining watch. The first 15-20 minutes of this film, I thought I was going to absolutely love it.
Yeah.
I was like, I absolutely loved Mickey Rourke's character. That when he walks into that board meeting of Triad members, what an amazing scene! I laughed out loud at it. I thought, I love this guy. He's a total dick, and it is going to be amazing. At the time, by the time you honestly almost feel sympathy for the Triad characters, right? And I thought, this movie's going to do something really interesting and like argue a case for, these criminal organisations live hand in hand with the city, and perhaps there's something to be said for turning a blind eye, and allowing them to self-regulate. But it's not that film at all. And by the time you get to the end of the film, and his character, who has shown scant regard for the feelings of anyone else in his pursuit of what he perceives to be this righteous path through the police department, willingly alienating himself from his peers and his superiors, including his wife, who gets her comeuppance quite brutally, and then all of a sudden, this character who has given us no reason to feel compelled to sympathise with him or feel any parallel between ourselves and him whatsoever. And I don't know, maybe there are people out there who watch this film and think, that's it, I totally understand Mickey Rourke's character in this movie. He's a great guy. He's not a great guy. And then all of a sudden, in the last 20 minutes, the film expects you to feel sympathy for the guy because he's a bit upset now that the wife, who he plainly didn't give a shit about before, has been brutally murdered because of his hubris. Like his ridiculous. It's not even naive hubris, because he must have known this is what was going to happen. He walked into a boardroom full of triads who were trying to appease him and suggest that, just keep your head down, you'll get a promotion out of this, we'll take care of the rest. And instead he chose to shout F you at them, basically, and insult them. Just a really strange concoction of a movie that I'm none the wiser as to what it was trying to say or what the purpose of this movie was. And honestly, in the sort of climactic showdown sequence, it feels like something from, I don't know, a Lethal Weapon movie more than anything else. Just really strange. And some real missteps in there. It can't possibly be making a case to be an accurate portrayal of how the criminal underworld operates in places like Chinatown. I can't imagine. If nothing else,
I'm fairly certain that the head of the triads are not going down to the docks to pick up drugs themselves in their car. That doesn't seem to ring true to me.
Yes, exactly. Or just sitting openly in like very, very down market restaurants where, with no bodyguards there to vet people approaching them with knives, for example. There's a whole lot wrong with this. I could almost talk about this movie more than any of Cimino's others that I've watched, but at least as much as Heaven's Gate. But I feel like we've probably expended too much effort in it already, Scott.
Fair enough. Let's crash on then to the Sicilian. Now, if one thing Year of the Dragon did manage to do, it was cement his reputation a little bit, or at least rehab it somewhat. He did manage to bring Year of the Dragon in on time and on budget, which was a shocking occurrence for everyone.
Remarkable.
Yet a mere 2 years later, and Dino De Laurentiis has allowed him to break free of the studio sound stages. Actually, that's one thing about Year of the Dragon. It was shot pretty much entirely on sound stages.
Yeah,
and from my
which
one,
I
it
didn't
looks
realise
incredibly
until
convincing.
afterwards. Yeah.
Apparently even fooled Stanley Kubrick, according to internet reports, and it is really well done. But for The Sicilian, it's another sprawling on-location epic. The Sicilian is based on Godfather author Mario Puzo's book about Salvatore Giuliano, the real-life gangster, with a mythos that has a bit of the Robin Hood about him. Now, of course, when you think about casting a character with a description of Sicilian gangster, you naturally think of French, well, let's call him an actor, Christopher Lambert. Of course, who else? Anyway, he takes the role of Giuliano, initially a black marketeer smuggling food into heavily rationed villages during World War II under the nose of the government. He's busted during one of his runs with his cousin and best friend Gaspar Piscotta, played by John Turturro, leading to a shootout that sees him critically wounded and a police officer dead. Piscotta takes him to a local monastery where he recovers, but realises he's now a wanted outlaw. Giuliano and Piscotta escape to Camerata Mountains, and the two eventually hatch a plan to set up in the organised crime business for themselves. They start freeing prisoners and stealing grain from the local landed gentry and distributing that amongst the poor, increasing his fame and causing others to flock to his banners. He grows more confident and audacious with each action, and soon winds up with him in the crosshairs of the church, the state, and the mafia, all of whom he refuses to bow to. This sets him on a collision course with these groups who attempt to remove the threat he faces in various ways, making Giuliano rightly more paranoid as time goes on. There's a subplot in here somewhere about a love interest, but it's so wildly underdeveloped that I can remember no details about it whatsoever. Now, there's not a great point picking over the minutiae of how this film has turned out, because there's the rather glaring central fact that somehow, presumably on a dare, Christopher Lambert was cast in the lead of this film. In terms of effect, you might as well have cast Pee Wee Herman as a lead, or Rod Hull, or Emu, all of which might have delivered slightly more convincing central performances than the slowly unfolding train wreck that's found its way onto screen. I mean, the rest of the cast are generally fine, although probably only just about fine, which is disappointing when you got the likes of Terence Stamp parading about. And Cimino was coming under terrible pressure to cut this film down in running time, and for once I think this had a bit more room to breathe. While Heaven's Gate spent a lot of time on nothing consequential, this runs at very much the opposite end of the spectrum, crashing on through events, making it hard to get a feel of the time frame we're supposed to be talking about in the film. It just seems unduly compressed. But, as mentioned, that's not all that important. The film lives or dies on Lambert's performance and charisma, neither of which showed up for the party. He's dire, and so, sadly, the entire film is dragged down to his level. A pity, as this is a story that has real potential. Who wouldn't like to see Robin Hood mashed up with The Godfather? But Sicilian is a banal, lifeless mess, and easily Cimino's weakest film that we've spoken about so far. There is a really great film in here somewhere about this man's life. This is not it.
It sounds like we're firmly in the wilderness years here.
Very much so. I mean, if you're picking out the small mercies you can get where you can, again, it looks absolutely gorgeous. If you put Michael Cimino on a set out in the real world, he will find a way to make it look beautiful, and lots of really lovely shots of like the internals of these grandiose buildings, where either the church buildings and where your bishops are talking, and state houses and things like that. Looks really great. Film itself, absolutely dire. Unfortunately, the leader's choice is just entirely incorrect. I cannot, for the life of me, imagine what they were thinking with this. Puzzling choice, and really just that alone sinks everything around it. He is a very big lee hole in the bottom of this ship's hull, and everything is just pouring out of him. Yeah, sadly, not one that is worth going in for. Again, as I say, some real potential in this story, and certainly it should have been a really good film if you'd cast almost anyone almost anyone in the world apart from Christopher Lambert. I don't know what they were thinking. I cannot get past it at all.
Christopher Lambert's not even that convincing as Christopher Lambert. I've never understood his casting in pretty much anything. Was it what was the film? What was the Besson film? Was it Subway or something? It was called that he got his career break in, right?
Yeah.
I'd kind of like to go back and watch Subway just to see whether Christopher Lambert ever deserved the opportunity to transition to anything else, because it seems like there was some head of steam he built up there, but I have never witnessed evidence to suggest that he has any acting skill whatsoever.
Nope.
In the movies I've seen. I can only imagine it's probably cast here. I mean, what year was this and where was it in relation to Highlander?
This was 87.
Right, so was that just after Highlander?
Perhaps.
I can't remember. I can't be bothered picking up my phone to check on account of Christopher Lambert, so let's just say yes, I'm probably right. He'd probably end up being cast in this because you know that weird thing where Hollywood look at a film which has performed well and they say, well, who was in that film? Oh, Christopher Lambert was in Highlander. Okay, audiences must love him.
Yeah.
Ergo, give him to Cimino.
Yeah. He's also foreign, and France is close to Italy. That'll do.
Yes.
That'll do.
Exactly. Does he have an accent? Great.
Close enough. If only they'd got Christopher Walken in to do it, in Christopher Walken's accent, it would still have been better.
Oh, my days. And that leaves us with what exactly, Scott?
We still have 2 to get through, but neither of which will take particularly long to get through. The next up was a 3-year gap between Sicilian and Desperate Hours. Desperate Hours is a remake of a 1955 Humphrey Bogart vehicle, which I must confess I've not seen. And it seems that he's finally taken on board Clint Eastwood's advice after Heaven's Gate, which is that he should go off and direct a small-scale, more intimate movie. He's again tapped up Mickey Rourke to play a sociopathic convict named Michael Bosworth, who escapes from prison with the help of his defence lawyer, Nancy Briers, played by Kelly Lynch, who, for reasons that the film does not see fit to tell us, is in love with him. He leaves her behind with orders to say that he forced her at gunpoint to help him, with instructions to join him later on. Bosworth is soon reunited with his brother Wally, played by Elias Koteas, and their dim-witted partner Albert, played by David Morse. They look for a place to lay low, settling more or less at random on the home of Tim Cornell, played by Anthony Hopkins, and his family. Tim was previously busy trying to repair his relationship to estranged wife Nora, played by Mimi Rogers, but they find themselves hostage in their own home, plotting a way to escape or overpower the 3 men invading their house. Meanwhile, the feds have not been convinced in the slightest by Nancy's act, leading them to convince her to betray Bosworth in return for a lighter sentence. They soon find out where Bosworth went and arrive en masse for the spot of the old sieging, and, well, you can guess how that ends up. Now, there's been a small degree of truncation in that plot recap, in the main to gloss over a few events that don't make a great deal of sense, even in the full context of the film. Surprise, surprise, Cimino had another battle over the cut of this film, and lost, with him claiming that producers butchered it, and I have perhaps some sympathy with this, because if nothing else it would explain the uneven, choppy pacing of the film that just absolutely ruins the flow of the film. This perhaps also marks the time that Michael Cimino either suffered hearing loss or perhaps had some sort of bizarre injury that destroyed his ability to select appropriate scores for films, as both this and his final film, but in particular this film, have ludicrous, intrusive, bombastic scores that overwhelm the performances and gives everything a horrible, melodramatic tone that really undercuts the rest of the film's narrative. Which, it must be said, was doing a good enough job of undercutting itself, with no real drama or intrigue to speak of. The characters are uniformly flat and lifeless, and we'd learn nothing about any of these characters if they didn't have someone outright read the dramatis personae for them. It's particularly obnoxious in Bosworth's case, who we're informed has a genius-level intellect. We have to be informed of this, because there's not a single shred of evidence for that assertion in the rest of the script. It should be noted that the screenplay was written by Lawrence Connor and Mark Rosenthal, who were recently both found guilty of writing Superman 4, The Quest for Peace. You'd think that this cast, even if we're only talking about Rourke and Hopkins, would have enough charisma and talent between them to provide some interest, But Rourke's off chewing the scenery again, and Hopkins seems bored of this entirely, and I can't say I blame him. The two leads might as well be in different films for all the chemistry they have, and the supporting cast are playing well below par also. Now, this sort of home invasion film has had something of a renaissance in recent years, but even if they've whetted your appetite, this is by no means recommended viewing. I've not seen the original, but it surely can't be any worse than this, so perhaps seek that out instead. Alternatively, a similar level of enjoyment can be had from a hot knife and a spot of DIY gelding. Do not watch.
Slammed.
Yes, another film where I get the central idea is not bad, but the execution is all sorts of terrible. Again, smaller, intimate, but unfortunately, Cimino cannot drag character out of anyone. This seems to be a recurring theme through pretty much everything he's done. He has characters in there that you learn nothing about, and they somehow are written or scripted or directed in a way that just you don't learn anything about any of these characters. It makes it very difficult to care about any of them. You can't establish them properly, you can't develop them, you can't give them any sort of journey. He just has people wandering around on screen, and it feels almost robotic in nature in many cases.
I'm interested in what you said about the score. I feel like that was something that ties back to Year of the Dragon, as though he's had some sort of early onset score Alzheimer's or something. Because I felt like that was a very odd trend that had exactly the same effect as you describe here. That it very much undercut the events on screen, and it tried to shoehorn in a level of pathos into that film that it wasn't doing anything to not just deserve, but it wasn't setting its stall out as something which was seeking pathos. But curious. So I'm interested in your comment there. And the last film we're going to talk about tonight.
The last one was a gap of 6 years. It was 1996 with The Sunchaser. This is his final full-length feature. He's done a few kind of, I think, documentaries. He wrote some books, and he did a kind of third of one film, I think. But this was his final full-length feature. In this, we have The Sunchaser. We have Woody Harrelson playing Dr. Michael Reynolds, a successful oncologist who seems to be on track for a promotion, which will no doubt help with the repayments on his flash car. This feature is derailed when a juvenile prisoner, John Ceda's Brandon Blue Monroe, is brought in to see him. Discovering that he has mere weeks to live, Blue stages a breakout and takes Reynolds hostage, starting out on a trip across country that leads to the land of his Navajo ancestors, with the whacked-out notion of salvation at the top of a mountain and a lake that a book promises will cure him better than any of this chemotherapy garbage. Reynolds is forced to go along with this, but over the course of the trip, the two bond, and when Blue's condition worsens, Reynolds breaks the law himself in order to help Blue reach his goal. The reasons for their bonding, or for a medical professional to go along with his magical claptrap, remain entirely unexamined by the film. Narratively, this is again very stripped back, and I get the impression that this is supposed to be overflowing with character, but John Ceda is not up to the task, and while external evidence would have you think Harrelson would be able to cut the mustard, this was the same year he appeared in The People vs. Larry Flint. He does not. There is no mustard cut during the entire production of this film. All the mustard remained entirely intact. Falling somewhere quite awkwardly between a road trip, a hostage drama, mysticism and a buddy flick, this plot does not convince in the slightest, and the characters are difficult, if not impossible, to warm to. The whole endeavour seems roundly amateurish, with only a few of Cimino's trademark beautiful nature shots towards the end of the film giving you any indication that this is a film from an Oscar-winning director, and not some made-for-TV Hallmark Channel production line schedule thriller. If Heaven's Gate could be characterised by how interesting a film it is to think about on pretty much every level, it's sad that Cimino's later career and Sunchaser in particular give us so little to talk about. There's not even a gloriously failed execution of a grand idea. This is a small film with small ideas and doesn't do them justice. According to Box Office Mojo, this film's domestic total gross was somewhere under 22,000, sneaking out for 1 week in 23 cinemas. going out with a barely heard whimper rather than a bang, and it does not seem exactly fitting given the heights that Cimino reached, or in any case in a lot of his films strived to reach. But it's hard to argue that Sunchaser deserves anything other than to be roundly ignored.
He's a difficult character to break down, really. Cimino. I know there's plenty of call from people who say that, had Heaven's Gate not misfired so badly, what different output he might have had. But I feel like there's enough evidence to the contrary to suggest that actually, something like The Deer Hunter might really have been a one-off. There's nothing else that sticks out amongst his portfolio to quite the same degree as that, or that had anywhere near the impact of that movie. And I just find it difficult to get on board, which is not, obviously now he's sadly departed. I don't wish any creative's career to come to an end because they've popped off this mortal coil. But I'm not convinced by the argument that it was all down to Heaven's Gate and the lack of opportunity that its failure to succeed therein afforded him. I don't see enough evidence in the movies, his output, from what you've said before, and certainly from what I've witnessed afterwards, to suggest that, this was anything other than The Deer Hunter was kind of, I suppose, a lucky strike or a moment of clarity for someone who otherwise struggled to, as you say, reach the heights he clearly strove for in a great deal of cases, but really wasn't able to pull together.
Yeah, and it's not as though he was not given chances after Heaven's Gate, because if nothing else, something like The Sicilian should have been an opportunity for him to knock something out of the park. It comes almost ready-made. The story almost tells itself, and he managed to not tell it. And even the smaller films that he's talking about, there is things you could have done with these characters to make them interesting. You could have dragged out more interesting performances, but he's worked with some really good actors over the course of his career, and with the exception of The Deer Hunter and arguably parts of Heaven's Gate, I wouldn't even say all of that, he's failed to get anything like a compelling performance from any of them. It's tough to make Terence Stamp boring, but that's what he did in The Sicilian. Woody Harrelson, certainly at this point in his career, should be able to coast through that film on charisma alone, and he is the blandest, most boring performance I've seen from him, and it's the sort of film you could imagine him getting when he just stopped being in Cheers, and it was like his first film role or something like that. It has that sort of ring to it, but no, this guy by this point had been in a number of kind of successful films where he was a very compelling performer in it, and he simply isn't in The Sunchaser. Now, of course, he didn't really have much to work with, but I've seen a lot of films where great actors are not given very much to work with, and they manage to do something with it, either by prompting by the director, or however that kind of alchemy works. It's hard to say, but
just by sheer force of charisma.
Yeah, but Cimino has never been able to get that out of anyone. If he hadn't kind of struck gold with an on-form De Niro and Walken and The Deer Hunter, you have to question whether that would have been the same. I kind of question, did he have much input into that? I get the impression that Cimino would have been a terrific landscape photographer. He might have been happy with that if he didn't have to deal with all these pesky humans running about ruining up the shot.
Or working as a nature documentarian on the Discovery Channel.
Yeah. But when you look back over his career, it is tough to see that he's had a great amount of impact on it. Curiously, I think for me at least, the film that actually works best in terms of what it was written to achieve and actually went out and achieved it would be Thunderbolt and Lightfoot. It's one of the few things. It's a relatively smaller scale film, and it's something that is nothing like the lofty pretensions that he would have later on in his career, and certainly doesn't make any kind of points about the society or anything like that. But in terms of just being a bit of entertainment, it probably works better and has fewer flaws than all the rest of the stuff that we talked about. Deer Hunter is, of course, his best film, certainly as far as I'm concerned. But the rest of his career just doesn't hit anything like the potential you would think he would have, having seen The Deer Hunter.
And now, sadly, we will never know whether he had it in him to pull something out of the bag.
Yes, I take it you're broadly on board with that. You've only seen the three, but you've probably seen very little evidence in Year of the Dragon that he's of it.
Yes. But, in that respect, I'm certainly very glad that I watched Year of the Dragon. It was an experience, and I feel like I learned something from it. But yeah, I mean, it's very, very clear that the Deer Hunter is the standout work here. As I say, there's a really good hour and 3/4 to be had from Heaven's Gate, but again, it's the first example that we've seen of what seems to be a trap that he's fallen into from what we've discussed and what you've said about the films I haven't seen. He seems to have been a director who had a great deal of difficulty deciding what should make it to the screen and what shouldn't. A lot of his folly seems to have come down to poor editing skills, or not the necessary degree of understanding of what should happen in the edit. And I don't know enough about the man and his process to understand whether or not those were down to editing decisions, or maybe it's just, hey, my editor shafted me. I find it hard to believe. I mean, it's still predominantly a director's choice. And he seems to have been unable to distinguish between the cromulent material and the superfluous stuff. And I think Heaven's Gate is the best example we saw of that, but it's a motif that crops up in one form or another throughout, by the sounds of it, the rest of his body of work post the Deer Hunter. So yeah, it's a difficult case to assess, but I feel like the balance of evidence rests on the side of, yes, lucky strike, but that just feels like we're being harsh against a guy who's no longer here to defend himself.
It feels harsh, but you've got to call them like you sees them. We've spoken about a good number of films there, and most of them haven't been very good.
No. So I don't imagine old Mikey's going to be turning in his grave too much at our humble podcast, so I'm sure we know he's faced harsher criticism. So yes, no, I won't be losing any sleep over it, but it feels more like this is someone who squandered their opportunities rather than having been denied them.
Yes.
And I think that probably just about does it for us and our relationship with old Mikey Cimino.
Yes, I think it does. Just before we wrap up, we'll mention one Twitter comment we've had in from our good friends over at the Magic Lantern podcast. That's at Lantern_cast on the Twitters. Again, just to reiterate, a tremendous podcast that you should be listening to.
What are those shameless miscreants saying to it?
We were asking what's their people's favourite Cimino film, and I think the general response has been, who's Michael Cimino? But the response from them was that Heaven's Gate remains their favourite, unfairly maligned. Year of the Dragon is my dark horse candidate. To which we think, we can agree with partially that Heaven's Gate is unfairly maligned for a lot of things. However, it's there's a lot of maligning you can do to it quite fairly, I feel. And I think we've done some of that in this podcast. And Year of the Dragon, I assume you're drunk.
But see, now knowing the quality of the work that Cole and Erica put out, I now really want them to do an episode on either Heaven's Gate or perhaps slightly less, well, no, more so perhaps Year of the Dragon. The gauntlet is thrown.
I would love to see where the positives come for in Year of the Dragon.
Yes, I demand satisfaction.
So yes, I think we'll wrap up at that point. As mentioned, if you want to get us on Twitter, that's at FudsOnFilm. You can hit us up on Twitter. You can hit us up on Facebook as well. It's facebook.com/FudsOnFilm, or simply email us, podcast@fudsonfilm.com. And we'll be back fairly soon. We'll be back on the 10th with a look at Manhunter and Red Dragon. Until then, please take care of yourself and each other. I am Scott Morris, so it's goodbye from me, and I'm sure it's also goodbye from my friend Craig Eastman.
We don't need you anymore.
Ta-da!
Bye.